In March 2026, Morgan Stanley published a 66-page note. It was not a product pitch. It was not an earnings preview. It was a warning. The bank's analysts had surveyed approximately 1,000 corporate executives across 5 countries. They had tracked semiconductor prices, model benchmarks, power grid projections, and labor market data. They had attended their own annual technology, media, and telecom conference, where the single most common question from investors was not about valuations or interest rates or returns. It was, "What will our kids do?" That question, asked by people whose profession is calculating risk, says something precise about where 2026 stands. Wall Street's anxiety had moved. It was no longer about whether AI investments would pay off. It was about what happens to society if they do. Morgan Stanley's conclusion was direct. A transformative, non-linear leap in AI capability is expected to arrive between April and June 2026, and the vast majority of businesses, governments, and workers are structurally unprepared for it. Not slightly behind, not catching up slowly, structurally unprepared, meaning the institutions designed to absorb economic shocks have not built the mechanisms to absorb this one. This is not speculation dressed up as analysis. Morgan Stanley framed this as a risk assessment, built on the same methodology the bank applies to currency crises, sovereign debt events, and commodity shocks. The difference is that those events have historical precedents governments can reference. This one does not. The report describes AI capability as the new coin of the realm, the foundational resource around which economic power will reorganize. What it implies, without softening the language, is that nations and institutions that fail to accumulate that resource, or fail to build structures capable of deploying it, will fall behind in ways that compound rather than correct. Governments received this warning the same way they receive most financial sector research. They noted it. They did not act on it. To understand what Morgan Stanley is forecasting, the starting point is compute, the raw processing power used to train and run AI models. Elon Musk has stated publicly that applying 10 times the compute to large language model training effectively doubles a model's functional intelligence. The scaling laws that support this claim, mathematical relationships between data, parameters, and model performance established by researchers at DeepMind and OpenAI over the past several years, have continued to hold. They have not plateaued in the way critics predicted in 2023 and 2024. The trajectory has remained consistent. What has changed in early 2026 is the concentration of that compute. The largest American AI laboratories, OpenAI, Google DeepMind, Anthropic, and Meta AI, have accumulated infrastructure at a scale that has no civilian parallel. The hardware build-out is measurable. Memory chip prices have spiked 6-fold in the past year, driven by the volume of AI infrastructure procurement. That is not a rounding error. That is a supply chain being restructured by a single category of industrial demand. Executives at major US AI labs have told investors directly to brace for progress that will shock them. That word carries a specific meaning in financial communication. Shock means discontinuous. It means a change that does not fit inside existing models. The evidence for where models already sit is concrete. OpenAI's GPT 5.4 thinking model scored 83.0% on the GDP-Val benchmark, a professionally validated evaluation tool that tests performance across 44 occupations in the 9 industries that contribute most to US GDP. The benchmark does not measure abstract pattern recognition or trivia retrieval. It measures actual work product, sales presentations, accounting spreadsheets, professional analysis tasks. At 83%, GPT 5.4 is performing at or near expert human level on the deliverables those 44 occupations produce. That score represents the state of the technology before the capability leap Morgan Stanley is forecasting. If scaling laws hold, and as of early 2026 they are holding. The models deployed in the second quarter of 2026 will be materially more capable than the ones that produce that score. The leap Morgan Stanley describes is not a single dramatic moment. It is the crossing of a threshold at which AI systems can perform the majority of knowledge work tasks with sufficient reliability that organizations face a direct cost incentive to substitute AI for human labor across entire departments, not just individual functions. The nonlinearity is not in the technology. It is in the economic decision calculus that the technology unlocks. ServiceNow has automated 90% of its customer service cases using AI. That figure is not a projection. It is a deployment result already achieved as of early 2026. ServiceNow's CEO has gone further. He projects that unemployment among college graduates could reach the mid-30% range within 2 years. That projection comes from someone who has already restructured a major enterprise workforce around AI systems and has direct visibility into what the technology can execute at scale. ServiceNow is not typical. It is a leading indicator. A large, technically sophisticated enterprise that moved early, had the capital to absorb transition costs, and operated in a sector where AI's capabilities aligned closely with its core workflows. Most organizations do not share those characteristics. Morgan Stanley's survey of approximately 1,000 executives across 5 countries found that preparation is concentrated in a narrow band of early-moving corporations. Outside that band, the pattern is consistent. Awareness of AI's capabilities has increased, but structural adaptation, reorganized workflows, retraining programs, revised hiring pipelines, updated risk frameworks, has not followed. The gap between awareness and action is a recognized feature of major technological transitions. During the introduction of industrial automation in manufacturing between the 1970s and 1990s, the time lag between when companies understood the technology's implications and when they restructured operations around it averaged several years. The difference in 2026 is that the capability timeline is compressed. The window between understanding and disruption is measured in quarters, not years. Nations are further behind than corporations. A coordinated national AI workforce strategy, one that addresses retraining at scale, social insurance for displaced workers, and educational restructuring, does not exist in any major economy as a deployed program rather than a discussion document. The European Union's AI Act, fully enacted in August 2024, governs AI system risk classification. It does not contain labor market transition mechanisms. The United States has no equivalent legislation at all. The organizations actually prepared for the capability leap Morgan Stanley is forecasting are, almost without exception, the organizations that built and profit from that capability. That concentration is itself a structural risk. Morgan Stanley's 66-page note does not confine its concern to labor markets. The chip crunch, the supply constraint produced by AI infrastructure demand, has spread. The bank describes it as having moved from data centers into hardware margins, device affordability, cloud costs, inflation, and policy. That chain of transmission means the AI build-out is no longer a technology sector story. It is a macroeconomic event. Memory chip prices, up 6-fold in 1 year, affect every device that uses memory chips: laptops, smartphones, medical equipment, industrial sensors. When a single category of industrial demand reprices a foundational input across an entire supply chain, the cost increase does not stay inside the data center. It moves downstream. Cloud computing costs are rising for the same reason. Businesses that rely on cloud infrastructure, which in 2026 means the majority of enterprises in developed economies, absorb those costs directly. Small and medium enterprises, which lack the negotiating leverage of large corporations, absorb them disproportionately. The power grid presents a separate and equally concrete problem. The United States faces a projected shortfall of 9 to 18 gigawatts of power generation capacity through 2028, directly tied to AI infrastructure demand. To place that number in context, a single large natural gas power plant generates approximately 1 gigawatt. Closing a 9 to 18 gigawatt gap requires the equivalent of 9 to 18 new large power plants, built and connected to the grid within 2 years. That is not achievable within current permitting timelines, which average 4.5 years for major transmission projects in the United States. The power shortfall creates a specific class of economic risk that compounds the labor market risk. If AI infrastructure demand cannot be met by domestic power supply, either AI build-out slows, disrupting the investment thesis that has driven $500 billion in AI-related capital expenditure over the past 2 years, or other sectors absorb power constraints, raising industrial energy costs broadly. On the labor side, the ServiceNow CEO's mid-30% college graduate unemployment projection deserves examination as a scenario rather than a certainty. College graduates represent the cohort most heavily concentrated in knowledge work: analysis, writing, research, programming, financial modeling, legal work, marketing, customer service management. These are precisely the occupational categories in which GPT 5.4 scored 83% on professional deliverables. They are the jobs the GDP-Val benchmark was designed to evaluate. If that benchmark is predictive, and its designers built it specifically to be, then the automation pressure on college graduate employment is not distributed across all job categories equally. It lands most heavily on the jobs that were, until recently, considered most secure. The economic shock scenarios in Morgan Stanley's framing are not independent. Power shortfalls constrain AI build-out, which changes the timeline but not the direction of labor displacement. Chipflation raises costs for businesses and consumers simultaneously. Labor displacement reduces consumer spending power at the moment inflation is rising from supply constraints. These dynamics interact, and no major central bank has published a framework for managing their simultaneous emergence. The absence of coordinated policy is not an oversight. It is the result of a specific institutional failure. The speed at which AI capability has developed has consistently outrun the speed at which democratic governance bodies can respond. Legislative processes in most developed democracies operate on cycles of 12 to 36 months, from problem identification to enacted law. The U.S. federal rulemaking process for major economic regulations averages 3.7 years from initial proposal to final rule, based on data from the Administrative Conference of the United States through 2023. AI capability is doubling, by Morgan Stanley's framing following Musk's compute scaling thesis, on a cycle measured in months. The mismatch is structural, not incidental. The European Union's AI Act, the most comprehensive AI governance framework enacted by any major jurisdiction, was finalized in August 2024 after 4 years of development. It establishes risk tiers for AI applications and sets compliance requirements for high-risk systems. It does not address what happens when a sufficient fraction of knowledge work becomes automatable. It does not include retraining programs, unemployment benefit reforms, or educational restructuring mandates. These were explicitly excluded from scope during the drafting process. The United States, as of early 2026, has no federal AI legislation. Executive orders issued in October 2023 directed federal agencies to assess AI risks and report on safety standards. The AI Safety Institute was established within the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Neither of these mechanisms produces labor market policy or macroeconomic stabilization tools. China has enacted a series of AI-specific regulations covering generative AI content, algorithmic recommendations, and deep synthesis technology. These regulations govern behavior of AI systems deployed to consumers. They do not address workforce displacement. The policy vacuum is not uniform across all possible interventions. Some nations have initiated workforce development programs with specific AI components. Singapore's Skills Future program, which predates the current AI acceleration, has AI literacy modules and reached approximately 660,000 participants in 2023. Denmark's flexicurity model, high unemployment benefits paired with active labor market programs, provides a structural buffer for workforce transitions that most nations lack. But neither Singapore nor Denmark faces the scale of displacement implied by Morgan Stanley's forecast for the largest economies. Morgan Stanley's note describes the current situation as a macroeconomic concern, language the bank uses to flag conditions that, absent intervention, become structural problems rather than temporary disruptions. Macroeconomic concerns become structural problems when the institutions that would normally intervene lack the tools, the timeline, or the political mandate to act effectively. In early 2026, all three deficits exist simultaneously. The investors at Morgan Stanley's Technology, Media, and Telecom conference asking what their children will do are not asking a sentimental question. They are identifying a gap between the economic future their models project and the social infrastructure that would need to exist to navigate it. No government has closed that gap. Most have not begun. Morgan Stanley's framing of AI as the new coin of the realm is precise language from a bank that uses language precisely. Coins of the realm are not optional. They are the medium through which economic participation occurs. Entities that hold them can transact. Entities that don't cannot. The forecast implies a binary outcome that does not unfold in a single moment but accumulates across quarters and years. Nations and institutions that build structural capacity to deploy AI across their economic activity gain compounding advantages in productivity, cost structure, and capability. Those that do not fall behind on the same compounding curve, but in the other direction. The compounding dynamic is the critical element. A 10% productivity advantage held by AI-capable firms in 2026 becomes a 20% advantage in 2027 if that advantage reinvests into further AI deployment. An economy where leading enterprises operate at that efficiency level and lagging enterprises do not is an economy undergoing structural stratification, not a temporary skill gap, but a durable reorganization of who produces value and who does not. ServiceNow's 90% automation of customer service cases is a data point in this trajectory. The company did not automate 90% of its customer service cases and then stop. The same investment logic that produced 90% automation in customer service will be applied to the next function and the next. The frontier does not hold still. For governments, the consequences of unpreparedness are not abstract. They are specific fiscal events. Unemployment insurance systems in most developed nations were designed for cyclical unemployment, job losses that occur during economic downturns and reverse when growth returns. Structural unemployment, job losses that do not reverse because the economic function that created them has been automated, strains those systems in ways they were not built to absorb. The United States unemployment insurance system replaced, on average, 42% of prior wages for eligible workers in 2023, according to the Department of Labor. It covers a maximum of 26 weeks in most states. A mid-30% unemployment rate among college graduates, the scenario the ServiceNow CEO described, would produce a claims volume the system has no historical analog for, at a duration that would exhaust its design parameters. Social systems calibrated for one economic era do not automatically recalibrate for the next. They require deliberate political decisions, legislative action, and administrative infrastructure, all of which take time that, according to Morgan Stanley's April to June 2026 capability window, is already running short. The 1,000 executives Morgan Stanley surveyed know this. The investors asking about their children know this. The bank itself, in 66 pages of documented analysis, has stated this with the specificity that financial institutions reserve for risks they consider real and near. What Morgan Stanley cannot do is make governments read 66-page notes and reorganize their labor markets in response. What it can do, and has done, is establish a documented record that the warning was issued, with a specific timeline, backed by specific data, from a specific institution that manages over $1.5 trillion in client assets. That record will matter later. The question of when later arrives is now a matter of months.